Então, bom dia a todos. Obrigada pela presença. I'll switch to English. I hope that's fine. I think it was advertised as an English-speaking anyway talk. So it's our pleasure to receive here a group of visitors from the Falklands, and we'll have a presentation by Phyl, Rendell, and Michael Poole. And Rody Cordeiro, who is also coming from there, will say perhaps a few words as well. I was supposed to introduce them, but we just talked, and perhaps they will introduce them themselves. So I think we can actually start. And I give the word to Rody, perhaps before? Was it that idea? And then?
Yeah, okay. My name is Rody Cordeiro. I work for the Department of Mineral Resources in Falkland Islands, so we're the licensing body and the regulator, so we're kind of the equivalent of the ANP here in Brazil. And at the moment, my role is mainly in terms of policy development and in the safety and environmental side of things. We're working to get quite a bit of environmental legislation put in to regulate the oil and gas industry. And yeah, that's about it really.
Yeah. I'm Michael Poole. I'm a member of the Legislative Assembly of the Falkland Islands. I'm a sixth generation Falkland Islander. I studied and worked in the UK for a few years after leaving school in the Falkland Islands, returned to the islands in about 2009, and ran the administrative side of the hospital. There's only one hospital in the islands, in the capital in Stanley, and then was lucky enough to be elected to the Assembly in late 2013. And we serve a 4-year term, so that expires towards the end of next year.
Yeah, I'm Phyl Rendell. I was born in the islands. I was brought up in the country, we call it the camp. I was brought up on the farms. I went to school in England, but I went back to the islands having qualified as a teacher. And I've been back continuously now since 1982, since the war there. I continued to teach in the islands, and then I moved into government administration, and I worked for 30 years in the government. And then alongside my colleague Michael Poole, we stood for election, and I was elected as a representative for the camp constituency in 2013, and it's really very nice to be here in Brazil and here in Rio today. Michael is going to give a short presentation on the Falkland Islands, so you have an understanding of the size, quite a large set of islands with a very small population, the size of our economy, and we'll explain why we've come to Brazil to try to build relations and possibly trade and transportation links too in the coming years. But we're again very grateful for the hospitality we've received here, and we're looking forward to hearing lots of questions from you after Michael's given his presentation.
Perhaps I'll sit there so I can actually see the presentation,
sure,
if you don't mind.
Thanks.
And then if that doesn't work, you can just use this one here.
Yeah, thank you very much. So before I kick off in terms of outlining the Falkland Islands itself, just to say that the three of us are here for the week. It's the first visit to Brazil from representatives of Falkland Islands government in almost 4 years. We've spent the last couple of days in Porto Alegre talking about agricultural and fisheries, kind of export, import. We're here for the day, so doing kind of seminars such as this and talking about oil and gas in particular. And then we're off to Brasilia this evening. We will take some political meetings and again, kind of similar things to this in Brasilia, and then finish up in Sao Paulo on Friday. Again, that's mainly focused on oil and gas, again, I think, the program there. And then back through to Santiago Friday evening and back to the islands on Saturday. So I was just going to talk a little bit about the kind of constitutional structure of the Falkland Islands. I believe you're mainly international relations students, so we'll focus in a bit on the politics of the region as well, and obviously the Argentine claim to the islands and what that means for us and kind of what message we'd like to give in that respect. But firstly, just to introduce the place, if I can work out. Perfect. So this is Stanley, our capital. So the islands are about 450 kilometres off the coast of Argentina. So you're distant south from here. We have a population of about 3,000 people, maybe a little bit over, 3,000 permanent residents, and at any one point there's about 1,500 UK military personnel based in the islands as well, in a small base that's about 50 kilometres away from the capital, Stanley. The islands are made up of two main islands, East and West Falkland, but we also have about 700 smaller islands dotted around there as well. And Phyl lives on one of those small islands and runs a small tourism business and farming business. So I'm sure if you've got any questions about that, she'd be happy to address them. Just to talk about the government itself. So we're an overseas territory of the United Kingdom. We have a modern constitution, which we last updated in 2011. So what that means is that the islands are internally self-governing, so the 8 assembly members are responsible for all local legislation and policy. We elect 3 of the 8 assembly members to form our cabinet, effectively our executive council, which is the executive part of our government, and obviously we have an independent judiciary as well. And the Foreign Office and the UK government are represented by a governor in the Falklands, so he's appointed by the Foreign Office usually for about 3-year terms, and the UK government retains responsibility for our foreign affairs and our defence. So they consult assembly members on both of those issues. We meet regularly with the governor and talk mainly about foreign affairs, but we also discuss defence issues with the Commander of British Forces in the South Atlantic as well. The 8 assembly members are elected for 4-year terms. We have 2 constituencies, Stanley, of which 5 of us represent. I'm a Stanley representative, and 3 for the rural area out in camp. And we have no political parties. Obviously, with such a small population, doesn't really make practical sense to have parties, so we all stand as independents. There's usually, on average, about 3 people compete for each place on the assembly. We do have relatively sedate elections. It's not the kind of adversarial politics of some countries. Clearly, you're going to run into people in the shop or in the pub, so you can't get too personal or bitter about it. But there is genuine campaigning. You will do TV debates, radio debates, publish a manifesto, and kind of make sure that people understand what you represent when they're casting their vote. There's just a few photos interspersed throughout this. Those are the black-browed albatross on one of our outlying islands. I think this is one of the Jason Islands, which is a kind of world-renowned site for black-browed albatross and kind of wildlife generally. A number of the outer islands are kind of managed by international NGOs in the environmental field. I think this one in particular is owned by a US-based group, and we're very conscious of our environment, and it's what attracts a lot of tourists to the islands, which we'll come to shortly. Just to give you a sense of the civil service in the islands. So the 8 assembly members set legislation and policy, and it's implemented by the civil service, which employs about 550 to 600 people. So probably about 30% of our working population is employed by the government. Not unusual for small islands and kind of smaller countries. And clearly, because of the lack of economies of scale in such a remote and small place, it means the government provides a number of services that others wouldn't naturally do. So utilities, the postal service are kind of government contracted and government managed. So this, I think, across the Falkland Islands government is about 30 different departments, and they're kind of grouped under directorates. And we don't operate a ministerial style of government, but what we do have is portfolios. So the 8 assembly members will each have responsibility for a particular section of the government. As an example, my responsibility is for kind of central policy making and environmental issues, and I also have a link into tourism development. Phil's responsibility is for agriculture and fishing and kind of natural resources generally, and other colleagues have responsibility for health and education. Kind of very similar kind of structures you'd expect in other governments elsewhere in the world as well. In terms of our income and kind of revenue streams, so the islands are entirely financially self-sufficient. The UK government is responsible for and funds our defence, but everything, all money spent by the Falkland Islands government are raised by us through taxes or licence fees. and the allocation of that budget is entirely our decision, and we receive no aid from overseas. Our main source of income, as it describes there, are fishing licences. We established a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone almost 30 years ago now. We mark the anniversary of that early next year, and that has been the main source of income for the Falklands government over a number of years. And as we'll talk about, it's not a big employer in the islands, but it is the main income stream for the government. We also have a growing private sector, so there's a taxation base there, both individual taxation and corporate taxation, and there are other kind of fees and levies that the government charge in terms of some of the public works and some of the public services that are offered as well. And we're in a very fortunate financial position. The government's annual budget is about $100 million US, and we're lucky enough that we have almost 400 million US in the bank. That's invested overseas on the international markets. About 50%, I think, UK kind of equities, and the rest around the world. And that returns a bit of an income for us, which helps support our annual budget, but also gives us that kind of confidence that we're kind of financially secure, and it reassures the UK government, who ultimately have responsibility for us, that we can fund our own requirements and won't be going to the UK government anytime in the future for financial support. In terms of the shape of our economy, our GDP at the moment is about 180 million US, in that region, maybe a little bit more. It fluctuates quite heavily depending on fishing catch, because up to 60% of our annual GDP will be based on fisheries. So if they don't catch it in any given year, it can have quite an impact on both the government's income and also the economy as a whole. In terms of exports from the islands, the great value, kind of 250 million US or so, is in fishing, is in squid and finfish. But we also have agricultural exports in terms of wool and meat. We have an EU certified abattoir that exports meat products, mainly mutton and lamb, into Europe. And we also have a small but growing tourism sector that is based on both land-based tourism and cruise-based tourism, and we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more shortly. Because of our political and kind of social ties to the United Kingdom, and also practically our shipping links have traditionally been up to UK, it means that a lot of our imports are still being sourced in the United Kingdom, but we do have a twice monthly shipping link into Montevideo now, which has been well established for a number of years, and we're seeing importation grow from the South American continent, mainly from Chile and Uruguay. But part of the reason for our visit to Brazil this week is to talk about and make some contacts in terms of imports from Brazil, and hopefully create a small but growing export market for Brazilian products. One point, and this was raised in Porto Alegre yesterday, that with the UK exiting the European Union in the coming months, a lot of our trade, particularly our exports, are into Europe. We're very conscious as a government that we need to maintain that market access, and we're lobbying heavily UK ministers on this issue, as all overseas territories of the United Kingdom are. It's important to all of us to some extent or other, and we're closely engaged with them to try and make sure that whatever exit treaty the UK agrees with the European Union, that the overseas territories kind of are recognised within that, and we continue to have kind of unencumbered access to that market. So now I think we're just going to move on to agriculture, and Phyl may wish to add to this, because it's more her area of expertise. But we have quite the islands historically have been an agricultural nation. It's why people kind of settled there originally, quite large farms, the kind of ranch farming, sheep farming mainly. We have some cattle, but not nothing compared to Brazilian numbers. We have about 500,000 sheep at the moment, maybe 600,000. I think that's been as high as 1.5 million or so in the past. So not insubstantial figures, particularly compared to the size of the population in the islands. Over recent years, the Department of Agriculture in the islands have looked to get dual-purpose sheep, so improved genetics, so you're getting a relatively good wool yield and quite a good quality of wool, which is being exported into Europe mainly. I think it's into Czech Republic and Italy, yeah, those kind of countries. But also with the abattoir having been established about 10, 12 years ago now in that region, looking to also breed sheep that are good for meat production, for export, and also some into the domestic market as well. And the abattoir do provide, on occasion, to visiting cruise vessels too, which we'll see some numbers in a second. And we'd hope that in terms of local produce, we would hope to be kind of relatively self-sufficient. At the moment, we do import quite a bit of fruit and veg from Chile. I think there's room for improvement there, and that's been a focus of our Department of Agriculture over recent years as well. Moving on to the fishing sector, which since the late 80s, our economy has been driven by. As I've said, Falkland Islanders ourselves are not really kind of fishing people. It's not something we have a great deal of expertise in. So when it was established in the late 80s, local companies were awarded licenses which are owned by Falkland Island residents, but generally they partnered with Spanish partners who are very familiar with deep sea fishing, which this is. This is quite a way offshore. These are quite big vessels that can hold up to about 60 or 70 crew, can hold a couple of thousand tons of product at any one point, I think. I'm looking at you, Roddy, I'm not sure if you know that.
I think it's quite a bit more, but yeah.
2,500 maybe. Quite large scale kind of factory ships, effectively. And so during the key points in the fishing season throughout the year, there could be 1,500, possibly even 2,000 people employed offshore in the Falklands, kind of in our waters, within the 200-mile exclusive economic zone. We have a number of commercial species. A number of those are kind of finfish. The biggest and most kind of valuable to the islands are two types of squid, ilex, which is a bigger squid, and calamari, which is a smaller one. Ilex is mainly fished for by Taiwanese and Korean vessels. About 80 to 120 of them will be licensed in any given season. The season for ilex runs from February till about late April time, and they will pay just a license fee to get access to that on an annual basis. And all the other fisheries in the Falklands are under what we call an individual transferable quota system. So it's a long-term access rights. So it's 25-year term, and to be able to purchase ITQ, you have to be a Falkland Island resident company and owned by Falkland Island shareholders. You can then partner with joint venture partners from elsewhere in the world. Many of them do, not all of them. Some of them are fully Falkland Island owned. But the intention of those long-term rights was to try and create greater value from our fishery for the local economy. We've seen that to some extent. We have seen onshore investment. We think there's still kind of room for improvement, and that's a conversation we're having with the industry in the islands at the moment, leading up to the expiration of their long-term rights in the next 12 years or so. Moving on to tourism, which only represents about 5% of our economy. Tourism's driven by penguins. That's the fact. That's why people visit the islands. There's a lot more to see, I can promise you, but people would love to come and see the penguins. We have 5 breeding types?
4 breeding
types. But you can see 5 types on occasion on the islands.
Yeah.
If you're very lucky, when you visit Bleaker Island, Phil's home, you might see 4 or 5 different types of penguins on occasion. So in terms of land-based or kind of people flying in, at the moment we only have one weekly flight from South America. It's from Santiago on a Saturday, so it comes in on a Saturday afternoon and leaves a couple of hours later. During the peak tourism season, which is about November till the end of March time, which is obviously our summer, and that's when all the wildlife is there, that flight can get fully booked. It holds about 150 passengers, I think, in that region, and maybe about 10 to 12 weeks a year. That flight is quite difficult to get on during that peak season. So we're currently in discussions around the potential for an additional midweek flight to the islands, we hope, from Sao Paulo, and that's part of the purpose of our visit this week. There's some politics around that which we'll come to shortly, but that's our goal. We'd hope next year to have a midweek flight, and we'd see more tourists, particularly from South America, coming in and visiting the islands, maybe just for 3 or 4 days to have a look, and it maybe makes it more accessible than a week-long visit would be. We also have cruise-based tourism, so I think the figure here is about 44,000 or so in 2014. The last couple of years have increased quite significantly. We're up to about 60,000 last season. We hope to reach about 65,000 cruise-based tourists this year. And these are, again, a mixture of quite large vessels that will hold up anything up to about 2,000 people, some of them about 2,200. So on a given day, with a cruise vessel or two coming in, it can double our population effectively. So Stanley can feel quite busy, but it's all good business, and it offers very good seasonal employment for people. And you find that a lot of people will have 2 or 3 different jobs, because we have effectively zero unemployment in the islands. So people will take a day off from their full-time job to go and drive tourists and offer tourism services. The majority of the cruise tourists are coming from the UK and the US, though most countries in the world are represented to some extent. And these are vessels that are doing tours around the kind of South American cone. Some of them are going as far south as the Antarctic Peninsula and to South Georgia, another small island in the South Atlantic, and coming back up, and will stop into the Falklands, usually for a day for the bigger vessels. Some of the smaller expedition vessels that might only have kind of 80 to 150 passengers might stay for a day or two and go around the islands a little bit. But they're not usually basing themselves there for more than 2 or 3 days at most. We have high hopes for the tourism sector. We have quite an ambitious development strategy that we hope to see the kind of contribution to gross domestic product kind of doubled in the next 6 or 7 years. We think that is realistic, particularly if we are successful in getting another flight into the islands, because the only means of access are the flight on a Saturday from Chile, and there's twice weekly flights with the Royal Air Force into UK, which is quite expensive. It's not particularly customer friendly in terms of booking. It's a very good flight, it's very well run, but it is the RAF, and they're military, and they're not used to looking after tourists to the standards you'd naturally expect. Another gratuitous shot of penguins there. I don't know, usually that picture needs to be shortened slightly. These are the king penguins, which is really one of the main draws. It's the most accessible king penguin colony in the world, is my understanding. It's only about 2.5 hours drive, quite a bit of an off-road from the capital. So the ships will come into Stanley, will anchor there, and probably about 80 or so % of the passengers on any given vessel will go off and do a day trip, either to visit the kings or to go and look at other penguins or wildlife in the area. And some will go and do battlefield tours from the 1982 war as well, and kind of some heritage tours around the town as well. And almost complete, but we have an emerging sector, which obviously Rody knows all too well. Oil and gas exploration was originally, the original round of licensing was done in the mid-90s. There weren't any commercial discoveries. There were some big companies then, Shell, BP, were they there?
No, Shell, Amarada, Hess, Lasmo.
Yeah, so some quite large companies you'd recognise and I'm sure operate in Brazil. They left in the kind of late 90s, and there was a bit of a lull. It picked up again, kind of 2009 time. Some new licensing and some new companies came in. Initially, small exploration companies, but there's 2 main areas of licensing. to the north of the islands, so about 150 kilometres offshore, in shallower water, so about 200 metres to 400 metres depth in the North Basin. And then there's a southern basin which is licensed as well, which is much deeper water, up to 2 kilometres of depth. And there's been a lot of seismic work around the islands, and was it 2010 was it the first commercial discovery in the islands, which was by a UK PLC, an oil company called Premier Oil. They've discovered a find to the north in about 400 metres of water, and they hope there's about 460 to 480 million barrels of oil, and there's still hope for further kind of exploration and further commercial discoveries to the north. And two of the largest companies operating there are Premier, who are listed in the UK, and Noble Energy, which are Houston-based, US-owned company. I think they're privately owned, aren't they?
Yes.
Yeah. At the moment, with the current oil price, development of that commercial discovery is a little way away. Break even on that is probably about $40 per barrel. So clearly, with the oil price hovering around that at the moment, we don't see that development being sanctioned in the very near future. But we hope that Premier Oil and their partners, they have some Italian partners and some French partners, will look to make a kind of sanctioned decision on that development, in the next couple of years or so. And if and when that does happen, it could, change the scale of our economy. It would probably increase the government's income by about, the estimates indicate, maybe up to about 10 times in terms of a royalty income and, in the longer term, taxation income as well. And we'd also see a kind of a natural population increase from oil development if it did occur. So the government's very conscious of managing its responsibilities in terms of environmental management. We borrow a lot of our regulation and legislation from the North Sea standards in the UK. We've also drawn on experiences from Australia. Some of our new environmental legislation will be based on the Australian system. And we've also had small delegations visit Shetland Islands in Scotland to talk about how they manage their oil income and approach to kind of oil development, and to Norway as well, who clearly have a very good record in terms of both managing their oil industry but also managing their oil wealth for future generations. The government's intention, clear policy intention, is to look to create a sovereign wealth fund if there is oil income coming in the future, and to kind of separate that from the annual budget so that it can be invested in infrastructure and longer term requirements for the islands that helps to ensure kind of our sustainable economic future. If there was to be no oil development, then we're absolutely comfortable that we can continue sustainably with fishing, tourism, environmental research, which is a growing area in the islands. There are a number of other things we can do, but the government would like to see oil development, hopefully within the next 5 to 7 years or so. So this is the last slide from me, which maybe allows us to talk a little bit about the kind of regional politics. That, as I've said, 8 independent members. So once we were elected in late 2013, we locked ourselves in a room for a couple of days and decided what we wanted to achieve as a government over our 4-year term. This just gives the headings. We have a small document, I think we've got a few copies around here we can hand out, called Our Islands Plan, which is effectively our manifesto for the 4-year term. And at the top of that list is ensuring our continued or kind of global support for our right to self-determination. Clearly the UK government is absolutely unequivocal in terms of its support for the rights of the people of the Falkland Islands to choose our own political future. The UN Charter enshrines that right as well. So we're very confident in the history and the legality of it all. But, as I'm sure you're aware, the government of Argentina do continue to claim the islands, and they're very active in terms of promoting their claim internationally. So we try and spend time both as a Falkland Islands government and with the support of the strong support of the UK government, just making sure that the international community is aware of the reality of the life in the islands, We did have a referendum on our political future in 2013. You may have seen some coverage of it at the time, where 99.8% of the population voted to retain our current constitutional arrangements. So the question was, are you kind of happy with the current arrangement of being a UK overseas territory? There was a clear, resounding yes to that. If there had been a no vote, there would have then been further referenda about what that meant and what people envisaged in the future. We do get asked questions about kind of independence and whether that's realistic for the islands. Clearly, with such a small population, there would be challenges. There are also challenges in terms of kind of defence of the islands, which we're reliant on the UK for. But I think ultimately, it's a question probably in my mind in 30 or 40 years' time we'll come back to and see what future generations kind of think. But most small nations find that they do need strong international partners, and we're British passport holders in the islands. We have very strong connections to the UK and to the community of the UK, and the community there are very happy with that as it stands. And I think that was really where I wanted to finish. Was there anything you guys wanted to add? Yeah? Yes?
I might just add that Michael mentioned about the potential for oil development offshore the islands. Nothing on the scale that you have in Brazil, but we would like to think that the Brazilian companies might become involved with our area. It's not so very far away, but that the islanders, the island government, manage and actually own that resource. It doesn't belong to the United Kingdom. The local government, the Falkland Island government, we own all our natural resources, so it's up to us if we want to develop it or not in a sustainable way. So it's our decisions. You often hear in the press, or you may hear the Argentines say, the British are exploiting that natural resource. It's not, it's us, the islanders, that make decisions on how we utilise our resources. And we think that for the long term, for the younger people, the next generation, this is the way to go. We should manage the oil industry responsibly. You do it in offshore Brazil. We should be able to do it off the islands for the long-term good of the economy and the future generations of the Falkland Islanders.
Good. So perhaps I should thank you for the presentation.